After Richard Goodall's special performance, it's important to note just how much of an impact his impressive vocals have made around the world.
There are moments on television that feel bigger than the show they belong to, and Richard Goodall's audition was one of them. A middle-aged school janitor from Indiana walked onto a stage built for spectacle, opened his mouth, and reminded millions of people why they fell in love with music in the first place. But the cameras stopped rolling months ago. The confetti has long since been swept away, and the internet has moved on to its next viral moment. So what actually happened to Richard Goodall once the spotlight dimmed? Did fame pull him away from the life he built, or did something quieter and more human take its place? This is the real story of a man who became famous almost by accident, and what he chose to do with that fame. Long before anyone outside of Terre Haute, Indiana had heard his name, Richard Goodall was simply a kid with a radio and an empty bedroom. He didn't grow up dreaming of stadium tours or record deals. He grew up singing along to whatever came through the speakers, testing his voice against songs that meant something to him, and finding a kind of peace in the sound of his own singing that he couldn't quite find anywhere else. That habit followed him into adulthood, long after most people his age had stopped singing into hairbrushes and started worrying about mortgages and job security. For more than 2 decades, Richard worked as a custodian inside a middle school in his hometown, a job he took partly because it was steady and partly because it was close enough to walk to. It wasn't a job chosen for glamour. It was chosen for practicality, for stability, and for its closeness to the community he already loved. And yet, inside those school hallways, something unusual happened. Between mopping floors and taking out the trash, Richard kept singing. Not for an audience, not for applause, just because it was who he was. Students would hear him humming or belting out a tune as he worked, and slowly, without either party fully realizing it, this simple ritual grew into a shared secret that the whole school seemed to know about. Every viral moment needs a spark, and for Richard, that spark came at an elementary school talent showcase. He stepped up in front of a room full of families and children and delivered a performance of a decades-old rock anthem with a rawness that caught everyone off guard. Someone in the audience had a phone out. The footage made its way online, and within days it had spread far beyond the walls of that gymnasium. What made the clip resonate wasn't just the quality of his voice, though that alone was striking. It was the contrast between the man and the moment. Here was someone who spent his days doing physically demanding, often overlooked labor, revealing a talent that felt entirely out of place with the modest life he lived. People shared the video because it felt like proof that greatness doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it's hiding in a school hallway, waiting for someone to press record. The attention gave Richard something he hadn't had before, an audience beyond his own community. Encouraged by the reaction and pushed along by people who believed in him more than he initially believed in himself, he decided to take the leap that would eventually define his public story. He set his sights on a national talent competition, understanding that it would mean stepping far outside anything he'd previously experienced, including boarding an airplane for the very first time in his life. The story of Richard Goodall isn't a straight line from obscurity to stardom, and that's part of what makes it compelling. Years before his viral breakthrough, he had already tried his luck with televised talent competitions and come away disappointed. An early attempt ended in an early elimination. Later, he submitted an audition tape to another major singing competition, pouring his heart into a rendition of the same song that would eventually make him famous. The response was polite but final. He had not made the cut. For most people, 2 rejections from 2 different platforms might have been enough to close the door on the idea of a music career entirely. Richard felt the sting of it, by his own admission. It's never easy to put yourself out there only to be told, twice, that you're not quite what they're looking for. But instead of retreating permanently into his routine, he let some time pass, adjusted his expectations, and eventually decided to give the audition process one more honest shot. This time with a more grounded sense of what to expect and less riding on the outcome emotionally. That decision to try again, without any guarantee of a different result, ended up being the turning point that changed the entire trajectory of his life. When Richard finally stepped onto that audition stage in front of judges and a live audience, there was a visible beat of stillness before he began. Nerves are natural in that setting, and he was clearly feeling the weight of the room. He chose to sing the same song that had already carried him through so much, a soaring, hope-filled rock anthem originally recorded decades earlier and later reintroduced to a new generation through a popular television series. From his very first note, something shifted in the room. His voice carried an emotional weight that went beyond technical skill. It felt lived in, like every lyric had been earned through years of quiet perseverance rather than rehearsed for a performance. The audience, initially curious about this unassuming man in work clothes, became completely absorbed. By the final chorus, people were on their feet. The judges' reactions said as much as the crowd's. One judge, known for blunt criticism, called the performance remarkable. Another praised his authenticity and talent as something rare. Then came the moment that would define the entire story. One of the judges pressed the golden buzzer, sending gold confetti raining down and guaranteeing Richard a spot in the live rounds without having to wait for a panel vote. Backstage, away from the cameras, Richard reportedly admitted that he had been crying while he sang, overwhelmed by what the moment meant to him personally. He described it as feeling unreal, a strange, dreamlike collision between his ordinary daily life and a stage most people only imagine standing on. That single sentence, "This feels unreal," seemed to capture something a lot of viewers connected with. It wasn't the practiced humility of a seasoned performer. It was genuine disbelief from someone who never expected any of this to happen to him. It's worth pausing to ask why, out of all the performances in that season, Richard's story struck such a nerve. Talent competitions produce viral moments constantly, but most fade within a news cycle. Richard's story had staying power because it tapped into something deeper than musical ability. It challenged a quiet assumption many people carry, that extraordinary talent belongs to people with extraordinary circumstances, that dreams are reserved for people who have the time, money, or connections to chase them full-time. Richard's life didn't fit that assumption. He wasn't taking vocal lessons on the side or performing at open mic nights every week. He was cleaning floors, sweeping hallways, and singing quietly to himself and to children who happened to be nearby. His story suggested that talent doesn't check anyone's job title or bank account before deciding where to appear. That idea, simple as it sounds, is powerful, and it's likely the real reason his clip spread as far as it did. Understanding why Richard chose that particular song adds another layer to the story. The track was written and recorded by a major American rock band in the early 1980s, built around a piano introduction that has become instantly recognizable to multiple generations. According to accounts from the band's own members, the song's hopeful message was partly inspired by words of encouragement one songwriter's father had once given him during a difficult period trying to make it as a musician in Los Angeles. Structurally, the song broke a lot of unwritten rules for rock music at the time, delaying its chorus until well into the track rather than opening with it. Despite, or perhaps because of that unconventional choice, it became a defining hit for the band and one of the best-selling digital tracks ever recorded, eventually earning recognition for its lasting cultural significance. Its resurgence decades later, thanks to a popular television series, reintroduced it to younger audiences and cemented its status as an anthem about persistence in the face of hardship. For Richard, the song wasn't just a good vocal showcase. It was personal. He has spoken about finding strength in its message during his own difficult stretches, long before he ever imagined singing it on a stage in front of millions. When he performed it during his audition, he wasn't just hitting the right notes. He was channeling years of using that song as a private source of encouragement. That authenticity is difficult to fake, and audiences seem to sense it instinctively. Here's where Richard's story diverges from the typical viral fame narrative. After the video, after the audition, after the golden buzzer moment played on repeat across social media, Richard did something a lot of people didn't expect. He went back to work. He returned to his job as a school custodian, continuing the same daily routine he had followed for years, even as offers, attention, and opportunities began stacking up around him. People close to him have described someone whose relationships with students and coworkers remained unchanged by the sudden fame. He didn't request a leave of absence to chase the spotlight full-time, at least not immediately. Instead, he tried to hold both worlds together, using vacation time and flexible scheduling from an understanding employer to balance television appearances, musical performances, and his regular job responsibilities. This wasn't purely about financial necessity either, though that was certainly part of the calculation. It also reflected something about his values. He has talked openly about how the version of his life before fame gave him a sense of security that he wasn't ready to give up on a gamble, however promising that gamble looked. Staying rooted in his community wasn't a marketing strategy or a humble brag talking point. It appeared to be a genuine reflection of what mattered most to him. Of course, balancing two demanding paths isn't sustainable forever, and Richard has acknowledged as much. As musical opportunities multiplied, from live performances to invitations to sing the national anthem at professional basketball games to appearances alongside artists he grew up admiring, he recognized that a full-time pivot to music might eventually become necessary. But rather than rushing that decision, he chose to let it unfold naturally, prioritizing stability over speed. Fame, even modest and well-earned fame, rarely comes without friction. Some of the students Richard worked around every day, who had only ever known him as the janitor who occasionally sang in the hallway, began teasing him about his newfound recognition. It's a kind of good-natured, slightly cruel humor that kids are known for, and Richard reportedly handled it with a surprising amount of grace. Rather than taking offense, he treated the teasing as simply part of being a public figure now, understanding that visibility invites commentary, some of it kind and some of it less so. That reaction says something about his overall temperament. Plenty of people who experience sudden viral fame become defensive or withdrawn when faced with criticism or mockery, even mild versions of it. Richard's response, by most accounts, was to laugh it off and refocus on the things that mattered to him: his family, his music, and the community that had supported him from the very beginning. Behind the viral clips and televised performances, Richard's personal life carried its own quiet, difficult chapters that most casual viewers never saw. Long before the cameras found him, he had endured the loss of a spouse to a serious illness, a loss that reshaped his life in ways far more permanent than any talent competition ever could. He has spoken, carefully and without much elaboration, about the emotional weight of that period, describing the experience of grief as something that knocks you down entirely before eventually forcing you to find a way to stand back up and keep moving forward. In the years that followed, he found new companionship, and this new relationship became a visible and meaningful part of his story leading into his television appearances. Their relationship reportedly grew steadily over time, offering him emotional support through the unpredictable rush of sudden public attention. Having someone by his side who knew him before any of the fame arrived seems to have played a real role in keeping him grounded through what could otherwise have been an overwhelming experience. Richard has said in various interviews and public comments that his focus these days centers less on where his career might go and more on being present for the people closest to him. That kind of framing, prioritizing relationships over ambition, runs consistently through nearly everything he said publicly since his audition first aired. Richard's musical life didn't begin or end with his solo television audition. He has long been part of a local band based in his hometown, performing at small venues and community events well before any national exposure came his way. Once his viral moment hit, the band's visibility grew alongside his own, leading to a noticeable uptick in performance requests and a busier schedule than the group had previously experienced. Richard has expressed gratitude toward his bandmates and their manager for helping him juggle these unexpected opportunities. Behind the scenes, practical challenges came with sudden fame too, particularly the financial strain of traveling for a national competition on a custodian salary. Flights, hotel stays, and the various costs associated with competing on a major television show aren't small expenses, and Richard didn't have deep savings to draw from. Recognizing this, someone from his home community organized an online fundraiser to help cover these costs. The response from his town and beyond was significant, with hundreds of individual donors contributing enough to fully cover his travel and lodging needs well ahead of the competition. It's a detail that reinforces the broader theme of his story. A tightly knit community rallying around one of its own, not because he asked for charity, but because his neighbors recognized how much his success meant, both to him personally and to the town he represented. As Richard's story spread further, it reached people within the music industry itself, including members closely associated with the very band whose song had defined his audition. Public acknowledgement from musicians he'd admired for years carried a different kind of weight than general internet praise. It validated, in a very direct way, that his performance wasn't just a feel-good human interest story. It was genuinely respected by people with real expertise in the field. Richard has described being cautious at first about some of this attention, worried that fake accounts or misleading posts might be circulating rather than authentic recognition from the artists themselves. That instinct toward caution says something about his grounded personality, even amid an experience that could easily have swept someone else away entirely. Once he confirmed the support was genuine, he responded with visible gratitude, thanking those who had taken notice of his journey rather than treating the recognition as something he was owed. If you were expecting a story about a man swallowed up by sudden celebrity, disappearing into a whirlwind of management deals and record contracts, that isn't quite what happened to Richard Goodall. What actually happened is quieter, and in many ways more remarkable. A janitor from Indiana became a viral sensation, appeared on national television, received one of the most coveted moments a televised competition can offer, and then simply kept living according to the values that got him there in the first place. He kept mopping floors. He kept showing up for his community. He balanced music with a day job for as long as it made sense to do so, rather than rushing toward a lifestyle that might have looked more impressive from the outside but felt less authentic to who he actually was. He leaned on the people closest to him, carried the weight of past grief without letting it define his public image, and let good-natured teasing from students roll off his shoulders rather than souring his outlook. Perhaps the most honest way to describe what happened to Richard Goodall after his moment in the spotlight is this: not much changed, and that was entirely the point. He didn't need reinvention. He didn't need a dramatic transformation into someone unrecognizable from the man who once sang quietly in an empty school hallway. His story resonated in the first place because of his ordinariness, his humility, and his refusal to treat his job as something beneath him. Fame didn't rewrite that story. If anything, it simply gave more people the chance to witness it. For anyone wondering whether dreams are only reserved for people with the right circumstances, the right connections, or the right amount of free time, Richard Goodall's continued, deliberately unremarkable life after fame answers that question clearly. Sometimes the biggest transformation isn't in what a person becomes, but in how many people finally get to see who they already were.